Hello, welcome. It's Tuesday, and as I mentioned before, it is National Poetry Month. April is National Poetry Month yearly, and the organization that really puts everything together is poets.org. So if you're interested in learning more about National Poetry Month, please check out their website. There are even some different competitions and things like that if you enjoy writing poetry, so do check that out should you be so inclined. Um, so these images actually come from poets.org. Every year they have like the official image of that year. The one that you see with the pieces of wood that says, "Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you." That is this year's image. And the image with the birds is last year's image, which I thought was really cool too. If you look behind me, if you can see it all, I do have a poster of this year's image as well that was sent to me that I hung up here in my classroom dining room as part of our background. But anyway, it's kind of fitting that it is National Poetry Month, and because of that, I have decided to have us move forward here with poetry. So we're going to be dealing with poetry for about 2 weeks, and then we'll move into literary critical theory, and then we're going to wrap up with a bit of a project that I'll explain later on. Anyhow, so let's get started into our discussion and study of poetry. So on the screen here, there are two images. I want you to take a look at these two images, and I'm going to name some things about these images, and you're going to pick which image goes with what I'm saying. And while this is happening, I want you to be thinking about what in the world does this have to do with the study of poetry, okay? So we have two pretty distinct different images here. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to name them. So just as you're looking at this, if you were to name one Kepik and one Una, which would be which? Kepik and Una. Okay? So this might not be very politically correct, but we are going to gender these shapes as well. So one is male and one is female. And what's important as we go through this exercise is for you to look back at the image to answer the questions or to decide which is which. Try not to think about what you picked beforehand. So try not to think about, ooh, Una is a female name. You know what I mean? They're made up names. So look back at the image. So Kepik and Una, male, female. Okay, now we're going to get a little more abstract. So one is a drum, the other is a violin. One is a drum, the other is a violin. What do you think? Just keep a running list. You can write this down if you want. Okay, compare with your friends later. Okay, what about colors? One's green, one's orange. One is green, one is orange. What do you think about that? One's gas, one's oil. One's gas, one's oil. One is a melon, the other is a lemon. And we can go on and on and on, okay? But the point of this is it's interesting to note that if this study, because this does come from a study that was conducted, if this study is done over and over again on a large amount of people, it is interesting to note that the majority, hold on, I'm going to kill my dog. Chubbs, go lay down. Go lay down. Go lay down. Here, play with your bone. Oh my goodness. Okay. Sorry about that. So, if this was conducted over with a lot of people in a bigger study, it's interesting to note that about 95 to 98% of people actually assign the same words with the same images. So, for example, and there is no right or wrong answer here. This is kind of like a psychological test. but a lot of people, the more bulbous image, the more rounded image, the majority of people will name that Una, will say that that is a female, will say that it's oil, will say that it's a drum, and will say that it is green. Okay, and so on and so forth. So again, it's just the majority. So the question then becomes, what in the world does this have to do with poetry? And I hope that you were thinking about that a little bit, because when we think about poetry, poetry is one of the most personal and one of the most emotional forms of literature that there are. In all literature, there is a connection between the writer and what he or she writes. But especially with poetry, poetry is really known for being an outpouring of emotion. And of course, you know, there's a lot of really great poetry, there's a lot of classic poetry, and then there's some not so great poetry. And we're not going to get into that. We're going to stick to the good stuff in this class. But what's interesting about this is because you are using words as the poet to create these feelings, these images, these emotions, these connections with your audience, it's interesting to note what sort of words bring up certain images. So in looking at the images, the abstract images that we have here, if you're trying to create a mood that is more flowing versus a mood that is sharper, you know, it's interesting to know what colors and what sort of words are associated by your audience with those sorts of images. So as I mentioned, especially with poetry, because for the most part you're using fewer words to create these emotions, it's really important to keep in mind the power of these words. So you may have heard the children's rhyme from back in the day, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, we all know that that's not really true. Words can really hurt, and words can be really powerful. A lot of really powerful people have used nothing but words to create entire movements in our nation and around the world. So it's important to keep in mind the power of those words, and we're going to be looking at some poems that really choose and use powerful words. So something else I want you to think about, and if we were in class, you'd be writing this in a journal, but I just want you to think about it. Do you enjoy poetry? Why or why not? Well, I'll tell you one thing. I enjoyed finding these memes of dogs. Roses are red. My name is not Dave. This makes no sense. Microwave. Like, what? That's hilarious. Dogs are gray, or I'm sorry, roses are gray, violets are gray. I'm a dog, because, you know, they're colorblind. Okay. Anyway, haha. So, do you enjoy poetry? Why or why not? And there are always some common themes in regards to the answers to this question. So, and there are some people who are on the fence as well, and that's okay. So, some people enjoy poetry when they are reading it for themselves or when they're writing it for themselves, but then when they are asked to read and analyze it in a class, not so much. Some people don't enjoy poetry because when they were first introduced to poetry in a class, they were beat over the head with it and they looked at rhyme and meter and kind of ripped the poem apart. And one thing I can guarantee you that we're not doing in here is any of that. There will be no discussion of rhyme, meter, verse, etc. We are going to stick to the big things: the emotion, the words, the connection, the communication, the universality of poetry, and how poetry can be beneficial in our lives. Because believe it or not, you can find ways that poetry can get you through situations, can help you with things, etc. We'll talk about that some more later on. Okay. So some of the common things about not enjoying poetry are things like this: that it's boring, that it's difficult, that it's full of deep meaning, that it all has to rhyme. Some people don't like poetry that rhymes. Some people don't like poetry that doesn't rhyme, or think that it's not a poem if it doesn't rhyme. So there's all kinds of different misconceptions, and they are misconceptions when it comes to poetry. Poetry does not have to be boring. Poetry can be really interesting. Poetry doesn't have to be difficult. There's not always that deeper meaning, okay? Yes, sometimes you have to read between the lines and think about what's being inferred and think about the images that are being created. But a lot of times that is not necessarily the case, and you can just enjoy the poem and get involved in the emotion and the images that are being created by the poet. And that's what we hope to do here. That's what I hope to do here for you, is to allow you to break these common misconceptions, if you hold any, and to help you enjoy poetry and to see the benefits of poetry and how it just might be important to you at some point in your life. I know that sounds far-fetched, but we're going to do it. Whoops. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is how do we actually read a poem? Because in order to discuss and analyze poetry, we first have to make sure that we're reading it, comprehending it, understanding it, etc. Poetry is something that you definitely have to read more than once. The first time you read it through, you're kind of getting the basic gist of things. You're getting the main idea. You're just reading it completely through. You're not stopping. If there are words you don't understand or things you're going to have to look up, you're not going to do any of that on the first read. Read it first, the first time all the way through. The second time that you read it, this is when you can go a little slower, chunk it up a little bit, go stanza by stanza or even line by line, look things up, write little comments down, mark up your poems, and really start thinking about things. And then upon a third read, you want to start paraphrasing it. Now, paraphrasing is taking something and putting it into your own words. Now, a lot of times, and I know we talked about this when we filled out those vocabulary sheets at the beginning of the class. And we talked about the difference between paraphrase and summarize. So if you remember, a paraphrase oftentimes ends up longer because where a poem might be inferring something about an image or an emotion or a feeling, in your paraphrase, you'll come right out and explain it, okay? So you're taking what might be only inferred in the poem and stating it outright in your paraphrase. And that's why sometimes it ends up being a little longer. And we'll practice that a little bit later on. Oh my. So when you paraphrase something, as I mentioned, you put it in your own words. You restate the ideas that seem essential. And as I was mentioning, it is line by line, and you are going to come outright and say what the poem might only be suggesting or inferring. So there are four major types of poems, and then within these four major types, there are all kinds of other types of poems. But we're going to focus on the four main types of poetry, specifically the lyric, the narrative, the dramatic, and the didactic poems. So first is a lyric poem, and this is what you see most often. So this is a short poem expressing the thoughts of a single speaker. Oftentimes this is in first person, but not always, okay? So these lyric poems, like I said, they are the most common. Lyric or lyrical in makes you think of like a song. And so when you think of that and think of the emotions that are coming about, and that's essentially what you're getting with lyric poetry. And again, we'll be looking at some examples. Narrative poetry is exactly what it sounds like. It tells a story. So there's an emphasis on almost like those plot points and the progression of the action within the poem. So epic poems fall under this category of narrative poetry. And there's an example here on the slide. One day. It was a deep August day on damp creek soil, just me, my sister, and a long roll of foil. I folded tiny, shiny ships. She made a long canoe. We built bridges, dams, and docks for our salamander crew. Each salamander silver-sailed, winking in the sun. If I could live one day again, this would be the one. And as you can see, it tells a little story, a little memory, if you will. Dramatic poetry, again, pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Think dramatic monologue when you think about this. So we have a character who is speaking, and there's no additional information from the author. And the person to whom they're speaking never answers back. Okay? And finally, there is the didactic poem. And didactic poetry focuses on the teaching of a moral or a lesson. So here you see a little Shel Silverstein poem, Listen to the Mustn'ts. You might be familiar with this. Listen to the mustn'ts, child. Listen to the don'ts. Listen to the shouldn'ts, the impossibles, the won'ts. Listen to the never haves. Then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child. Anything can be. Gotta love Shel Silverstein. So those are the four major types of poetry that we'll be talking about. So what I would like you to do now, if you did not already, I would really like it if you would um, listen to this one more time. You can kind of fast forward and pay attention to the four major types of poetry and how to paraphrase. If you didn't jot down some notes, if you could please take some notes, that would be fantastic. We are going to be circling back to this information as we continue our study of poetry the next 2 weeks. Okay, and that's all I need you to do today. Tomorrow, you will be working on paraphrasing a bit. We're going to be studying a poem called Aunt Jennifer's Tigers and focusing on that paraphrase and how it looks different from a summary. So you'll be doing both a summary and a paraphrase of that poem tomorrow, and then we'll progress from there. So more on that tomorrow. So like I said, please rewind and watch this recording again, jot down some notes, and I will talk to you all tomorrow. As always, if you have any questions, please send me an email. I hope you are all well and safe and healthy, and I will talk with you soon. Bye bye.